Hey guys, aka88 on cars. Right, today we're going to talk about my first couple of car stories, starting with my very first car that I spent far too much money on, a couple of bad experiences with different examples, makes, models I had next, finishing with a car that saved me from the hobby in its entirety. This should be fun, let's get into it. Right, so let's talk about my first car. My parents persuaded me not to get a motorbike when I was 16, so I waited a painful year to get my very first car, which I could drive after I got my driving license when I was 17. Now, I lived in rural Devon at the time, so this was going to be a new pipeline to connections of friends and everything else that I never had before. So my very first car was a bright red 2002 Vauxhall Corsa C SXI with 20,000 miles on the clock. And in my 16-year-old version mind, this was the most amazing sporty car that you could have ever seen. I was infatuated by this thing. Modification ensued almost instantly. However, because I was 16 at the time, the sort of modifications that were undertaken were very teenager-ish, shall we say. My first modification I actually put in was some black and white seat covers that, again, were supposed to make the seats look like bucket seats. The 16-year-old version of me thought that was pretty nifty, and some nice new floor mats. They felt really nice, and suddenly I was like, this is going to be a place where all my friends are going to want to be. That was modification number one. Modification number two was a booming system for me tunes. So I got a Audio Barn 15-inch woofer and two Pioneer subs and started to then build a boot build. You know, I grew up playing Need for Speed Underground. That's what all the cars had in. Mine should have one. That was actually something that I built almost completely by myself. I got it wired by a local garage, and actually it worked out remarkably well. Nothing caught on fire, and after I passed my test, freedom was given to me. So after I passed my test, I think I managed to buy some 17-inch wheels for the car that I bought for something like 150 quid off a friend of mine, with almost bald tyres that I had to replace almost instantly. And I also went down to the local Halfords and couldn't afford an exhaust system, so I thought one of those sort of large 3.5-inch tips, stuck that on the back of the standard Corsa exhaust, and I thought I was king of the streets in Devon. The one good thing that came out of these cringy modifications is it encouraged me to join a number of local car clubs. Now, this is the early 2000s when car culture is definitely booming in the mainstream, even more so than it was these days. So I joined a bunch of car clubs, and I met a huge amount of friends that really made my sort of my late teens, early 20s quite memorable. It was this second group of friends that I didn't have within school. So after getting into the car culture a little bit, I decided that I really wanted to immerse myself into it and build a show car. Mistake number one is coming up in that thought. And at the time, I only just started working. I didn't really have a lot of money, so I decided that I was going to try and colour code the car with rattle cans. It looked good for about a day before the paint matured and then changed to an entirely different colour. At this time, I decided that I was just going to respray the car, and one of my friends at the time said, oh, you should respray it in this colour called Ardent Blue, which, if anyone knows anything about Vauxhalls, especially in the 2000s, was quite a famous colour. You see them on Corsa VXRs and Astra VXRs, you know, to this day. So I decided I was going to do that, and I decided that I was also going to order every single aftermarket part from the Immersia website that I possibly could do. So I built up all these parts, I took it to a local sprayer, and off it went, and the car changed so it was blue with white wheels. Now, this probably ensued the best time I had with the car. I spent already too much money on it. We're probably sort of £2,500–3,000 into it at this stage, just on the bodywork and body kit parts, but it allowed me to enjoy the car in its perfect state, and that was great. And again, I was in my late teens at this stage now, and I wish I had just left it there. This was mistake number two. So I did a couple of other little bits and pieces. I got a second-hand blue interior out of a Calibra of all things and made it fit within the Corsa C. And again, the car looked really great, but then I was questing for more and I wanted to get more power. I thought about turbocharging the 1.2 75 brake horsepower engine that was in there to start off with, which I didn't do. And at the time I decided that this was when the new Corsa VXRs had just come out. I wanted to see if I could get that engine in my Corsa. Surely that would just be making it like the VXR version of its predecessor. Great in paper, did no research into whether the engine would fit, whether there were any conversion kits, how I was going to deal with the ECU, all those things. And because the engine was really new at the time, no one made any kits for it. So I bought an engine that literally had 5,000 miles on the clock. And this was, we're well into the mistakes now. So beyond that, I then decided that I spoke to a few places about where I was going to get it fitted. And I spoke to some proper Vauxhall tuners who were obviously more expensive. And I made the mistake of using friends of friends, local garage style setup that turned out to be a phenomenal waste of money. So we pulled the old engine out, the VXR engine went in, the engine bray got sprayed because it was still red because it was previously red before, and that's basically where the car stopped. I then proceeded to spend far too much money on trying to make this engine work until I finally admitted defeat and decided I was going to put a 1.2 engine back into it and then just sell it, which was pretty crushing at the time. So with late teens, early 20 dreams shattered, I started looking for what could be my next car. And one of the cars that I always really liked the idea of on paper was a Polo GTI, the 6N2. So I went off and bought one of them. Now, I had a really terrible experience with this car, probably because I bought a dog of a car in the first place. So on paper it looked fine, it had relatively low mileage, and it looked good. I bought the car at night. Never buy cars at night. Poor answer. It was a long way away, we had to drive 6 hours to get there, and it was all on us, the reason why it took so long. Anyway, I brought the car back in the light of day. It was a bit of a dog. It had, most of the bodywork was a bit sketchy. The wheels, which were these BBS, I think 2-piece wheels, standard, all the lacquered finish had come off. Those cars have electrical gremlins as well, so the central locking just randomly stopped working. The car nearly always smelt of damp, even in the dry as well, and there was definitely some engine and gearbox gremlins pretty much in there. So I decided I had enough of that car quite quickly and sold it. So at this stage, I've had 2 semi-failed projects. Anyway, at this time, the Corsa hadn't actually been sold, it was just finished working, and I actually managed to swap the Corsa, almost a direct swap, for the car that I wanted to build in an earlier form, which was a Corsa B with a C20LET turbo engine, so that's the 2-litre turbo engine, out of a Calibra at the time. And finally, we were onto some part of a winner. So when I swapped the car, I actually finally had the turbo dream, and this car was for Corsa B pretty clean. It was a 3-door. I think it was previously a 1.6 GSI, so it was a relatively high spec by most accounts. It was also, I believe, an R-Reg, so a fairly late in the Corsa B run time, and I had a great time in that car, and that instilled a small little nugget in my mind of a car that you had to drive it very carefully, otherwise it would steer you into a hedge. I specifically remember one time when I was coming up to a particular sort of common overtaking part on a way home one day on a summer's day, and there was a people carrier in front of me. It was 60s limit and they were doing about 40, so I thought, right, let's get by them. Put the car into second gear, put my foot down, and the car decided to, at sort of 40 miles an hour, break traction. So the car suddenly started torque steering me left to right, up to the rev limiter, into third gear, and I'm sort of struggling to overtake this car. And I remember glancing over to my left-hand side to see, as I was passing this people carrier, this entire family just horrified at this sort of early 20-year-old guy sort of manholding this car as it was trying to sort of steer him into the hedge. Anyway, I got past and laughed all the way home. And to this day, that little nugget of a car that you can, if you can't just drive it full throttle everywhere and it will just maintain. You know, I do like a car that will want to try and steer you into the hedge ever so often. So anyway, I had a great experience with that Corsa B. So if I had such a great experience with the Corsa B, why did I sell it? Well, this was another lesson learned. So when those conversions are done to the Corsas, effectively for the drive shafts, for the hubs, effectively, you have to get conversion hubs to fit the wider 2-litre XC C20LET drive shafts. But how they actually make them is they just take a standard Corsa B hub and basically just mill it out and put in, you know, a spline shaft that fits into the hub. So what you end up doing is effectively eating the wall of the hub up to make the shaft fit. Anyway, the car was making this weird creaking noise. It wasn't CV noise, but when I turned the wheel, it would make this like cracking, creaking noise. Anyway, one day in I think I'd like November, December, somewhere around Christmas, I'm driving this car at a relatively leisurely speed when I hear this almighty bang to get out the car to find the front wheel is sort of like this, and effectively what happened is the hub sheared off right down the middle, the entire hub separated from the upright, and the only thing that kept the wheel attached to the car was the brake caliper. So yeah, at that point I decided it's maybe not a good time to you know, keep this car. So at this point I'm about 5 years into my car ownership journey, and so far I've had a car that I made really great and then through childish mistakes made terrible and flopped. I've had another car that was just terrible. I've had another car that was really great fun, but you know, things would occasionally blow up on it. And I was at the stage now where, by my own terms, I'd spent quite a lot of money on cars and hadn't had the best of journeys through them. At the time, I was commuting about an hour to work each way, and I wanted to find something that was the best of both worlds. So something that looked pretty cool, that was pretty quick, but was also pretty reliable. I really didn't have a lot of money to spend. I think I had a budget of £4,000 was the maximum ever. And the saviour that converted me back to cars again came in a very unusual form, and you're not going to get this, but it was this car here. So this is a Peugeot 206 GTI 180. So Peugeot made two versions of the GTI. I think they made one version that had, I think, 120 or 130 horsepower, and then this 180 variable valve time version with really cool bucket seats in. And you know, French cars are not known for being the most reliable. This thing was an absolute gem. I think I bought it for $3,500. It had a tiny ding on the front wing, but other than that, it was relatively low mileage. I think it was about 48,000 when I bought it. Really nice spec inside, and this car was again amazing because it was reliable. And this has taught me something that I apply to cars these days. Having something that's super quick is only as good as how reliable it is. If it breaks down every 2 seconds or blows up every other second, it can be fun for a short period of time, but it gets monotonous in the end. The 206 was just what I needed. And again, I really wasn't expecting it to like it as much as I did. You know, it had torsion bars, I think, still on the rear, so it wasn't like the suspension was relatively well set up. But by all accounts, it was a lesser car to, you know, like the Renault Clio Sport equivalents at the time, one of which I later did own at a later date. But at the same time, it was great at what it did. I modified it a little bit. We put some front Moretti headlights in. I think we resprayed certain bits of it as well. I think I put an exhaust and an induction kit on, and it was beautiful. I owned that car for almost 2 years and then sold it, I think, for $3,800 at 60,000 miles with even more mileage on. So a great experience. And if it wasn't for that car, I would have never got the Boxster. I would have never started sort of buying and selling a few cars to get up to the Boxster, because that's actually how I afforded to buy it. I would have never have got into the S2000, I would never have got into the Civic, and I certainly wouldn't have got into my current car at the moment. Now, I suspect many of you didn't expect me to say that my car sort of hobby journey was saved by a Peugeot 206, and even to this day I'm surprised by that. But isn't it funny, sometimes you shouldn't meet your heroes, sometimes you should, and sometimes you're saved from a left field car that you never thought you'd be interested to start with as well. I actually have owned a number of other cars at the same sort of time, but as I sort of alluded to before, at the time I was involved in sort of the car automotive world, and I was buying and selling cars on the side, not a huge amount, one or two every time, to try and afford my dream car at the time, which was a Boxster S, and also to win a £100 bet with a friend of mine, Ross, as well. So if you thought this video was interesting, I can give a bit of an intro to the cars that I bought and sold there. There's a picture of a couple of them here, again, wild and wacky in their nature, from MGs that were painted bright orange to Renault Clios that I bought from Wales and silver, and a whole bunch of stuff in between. If you want to see a video on that, I'm happy to make it. Otherwise, thanks for staying tuned right to the end. I'm working on my late father's VX220 Turbo, and the car is at the moment at TDI, so Talk Developments International, over in London, getting work done, and I'm going to have it soon. So if you're not subscribed already, please do subscribe and stay tuned for that. What did you think of the video? If you liked it, please leave me a like. Otherwise, please leave me a comment. I do try to respond to all my comments. And otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and look forward to see you guys soon. Take care.